meeting, please. Thank you very much. Hello, good morning. Housing Needs and Production Technical Advisory Committee. This is our 5th meeting. I'm Deb Myhoth, the facilitator, working with the DLCD team on our NAPTAC work. Glad to see you all here this morning. I am going to review the agenda, and then we're going to get right into it, as has been our habit. As much as possible, it would be great for you all to have your cameras on. For those who are viewing via YouTube, without cameras on, it's hard to know who's in the room. But I understand not everyone has that option sometimes, and internet access is not always achievable that way. But as much as you can, that would be great. So, and then just, general ground rules to remember: we're here in a space to learn from one another, listen to one another, make room for everyone to participate. This group was intentionally put together with very diverse opinions. My job will be to try to help tease out those diverse opinions so that staff and decision makers have rich information to use in this rulemaking. I would direct you, of course, to the TAC operating principles if you have questions about any of those. I'm also happy to talk to you later. To get right into it, today we will be exploring the connection between needed housing characteristics, as the statute defines it, and affirmatively furthering fair housing, and that nexus between those, and exploring what the options are. We're starting with the brainstorming session you all helped us with from meeting number 2. Those meeting notes are linked in the agenda if you need to review that. And then you probably are getting the speed and momentum of things here. Last meeting we talked about type. Next meeting we'll be talking about location, and then May will be bringing these things together some more. So this is that deeper dive like you did with type a couple of weeks ago. This will be that deeper dive with characteristics and affirmatively furthering fair housing. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Celestina this morning to outline our racial equity framework for the discussion today.
Thanks, Deb. Good morning, everybody. We got to see so much of y'all in March that I've missed you. Today, we are focusing on the 2 sections of the racial equity framework here at DLCD, titled Data Equity and Data Justice as related to needed housing, and Community Engagement and Empowerment as related to needed housing. And today, as Deb just introduced, we're specifically talking about the characteristics of needed housing. So that's the layer that we're going to be digging into these 2 topic areas in. I will give some voice to the specific sub-questions right now in each of these categories. But before I do that, I will just remind you and us that these are questions that ultimately we will be seeking to answer to the best of our ability and be accountable to at the end of this rulemaking process. And as best as you all are able to weave them into your thinking and your comments, the more those comments kind of will be queued up for this analysis and really applicable to the charge that we have for this rulemaking. So you'll also notice that these are the same questions that we had last week, which was a little bit of a switch up because we decided to switch the way we were running our overall arc of meetings. So these are the same questions that we had last week on our deep dive on types. They'll be the questions we look at today for characteristics, and we'll also look at these questions and subsections for the deep dive meeting on locations. And then we'll focus on some other section areas for our May meetings. So without further ado, data equity and data justice. Are the data and research you are using for analysis framed with a data equity and data justice focus? If not, where might you obtain this data? If data equity and data justice resources are not available, what would you suggest as a way to obtain this information? And is there qualitative data available? These are things that we have already started discussing in this TAC, so I know that some, if not all of you, are already thinking about some of those questions. And then community engagement and empowerment. What are the methods of engaging communities in the development of this rule? What are the racial and geographic demographics of communities engaged during the development of this rule? Were there any specific issues raised by communities of color about the impact of this rule? What are they? Did this impact or change the development of the rule? If yes, how? If no, why? And how have DLCD advisory committees engaged with this rule? So I'll also just frame that part out, that of course we have a parallel engagement process on the staff side that you all are not expected to, track. But these questions do, still, there are parts of these questions that still apply to the conversations we're having. I know that last meeting we talked a little bit about the toll of engagement, the work and the load of engagement, even with regard to the Goal 10 documents and the HPS program. So any way that you all want to take these concepts and these questions and carry them with you in today's conversation is welcomed and invited. And at the end, we'll do something slightly different this meeting than we've done in past meetings, where Deb will just have a couple of quick minutes to give us an opportunity to reflect on those questions again, kind of in closing, so we can keep them top of mind and heart. And with that, I will give it back to you, Deb.
Wonderful. Thank you, Celestina. Appreciate that. And appreciate the thoughtfulness DLCD is giving to bringing the framework into the discussions and really helping us through that. So as with the past few meetings, we have our crack team of subject matter experts here to lend us a hand this morning. Alan Lazo, who is a commissioner with LCDC and is former executive director for the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, and lots of other roles Alan plays in this space. And Andre Tremblay, who's been working in the world of fair housing planning for a very long time. And we're really fortunate to have her here to help line us out a little bit on the topic of characteristics and affirmatively furthering fair housing. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Andre.
Thanks, Deb. And Mari, we can go ahead and share screen. It's really great to see all of you this morning. And so today's discussion is going to be talking about the intersection of fair housing and needed housing. And in particular, we're going to be talking about characteristics of housing. So, and we're going to be thinking about what kinds of characteristics do we need for our housing in order to meet the needs of protected classes in the area of rental housing, home ownership housing, and housing for people with disabilities. Okay, next slide. So before we get into the nitty-gritty details of what we're doing here and our discussion, I want to really kind of zoom out to the big picture and invite you to think about the housing production strategy as an opportunity for the city to really put in place a community mobilization plan to address the critical housing shortage that we have in our communities and to plan for future residents that are coming here. It's the law says that it's the city that does it. So it's a whole city effort. And I don't need to tell anyone on this call that we have a housing crisis in Oregon. So it really is a mobilization effort. Next slide. So it's the train tracks indicated like where are we headed? And so the state law gives us some guidance on that the actions identified by cities have to promote the development of needed housing, and it also has to affirmatively further fair housing, as well as develop and help maintain housing that's of high quality and housing that is well connected to the things that people need to thrive. Next slide. So we also know from the regulations that have been adopted already, and which may be changed, but that are in place now, that the intention is to achieve equitable housing outcomes, fair and equitable housing outcomes with respect to the location of housing, things like housing choice, housing for people experiencing homelessness, affordable home ownership and rental housing, and also addressing things like displacement and housing stability and gentrification. So we're going to be focusing today on fair housing, home ownership, and affordable rental housing, and housing for people with disabilities. Next slide. As I said before, and this may be, I don't say new, but it's something I really want to emphasize today, that it's in order to really do this mobilization effort, cities are not limited to land use actions. You've got to do a lot of different things to get to where we want to be, which is building needed housing, especially housing for people who have the fewest choices currently. And so even in today's toolkit, the one that is posted on the DLCD website, we have things like, of course, zoning and code changes and dealing with regulatory impediments, but things that deal with financial incentives and tax exemptions and abatements and land acquisitions and leases and partnerships. So you're getting outside of just what the planning department can do. And to think more broadly, this is sort of a mental construct that I use, which may or may not be helpful to you, to think about what can cities do? Well, they've got laws, so they can regulate, require, or restrict. They can use laws to incentivize or disincentivize. They can produce directly. And that's one of the big differences between housing and, say, transportation, or public services, other kinds of necessary things like water and sewer, that the city produces those things often directly, or local government does. And with housing, you've got to interact with the private sector and nonprofits in the market. And so that brings us to collaborate and co-produce, which is how a lot of the, I'll say, subsidized housing gets done. But something that often gets overlooked is cities can also persuade and advocate. And using the bully pulpit as a way in different venues is a way to kind of mobilize and make things happen. So it's important not to underestimate the importance of that. So next slide. And as we said, so then the task for affirmatively furthering fair housing and building needed housing or fostering the development of needed housing is bigger than just the planning department. And so when you do the work that you do, it's important to think about how to involve some of these other partners. Maybe they're on your advisory committee, maybe they're focus groups, maybe you have a team of experts that you tap into. There are a lot of different formats, and we're not here to dictate that, but it's a mobilization of everyone. Okay, next slide. So that kind of sets the frame for thinking about needed housing. And needed housing answers the question of what it is that we're trying to generate. We're talking about structures, basically, whether it's rehabbing existing structures, existing housing buildings, or whether it's building new. And we know that needed housing deals with types, characteristics, and locations. The next slide shows the intersection of needed housing and fair housing. Fair housing stresses who you're trying to build housing for. And we think in terms of people or protected classes. Third slide. And then the thing that intersects with all these is the whole issue of equity in general and racial equity, which give us the how and the why of why we're doing this. Next slide. So I know I'm being very cerebral, and in your discussion, you're going to get down to the nitty gritty of like, what does this mean in terms of the choices that we have to make? But I'm going to kind of go along the cerebral for a little bit longer, the abstract, and kind of review a few key things about fair housing. Next slide. So from, I think it was 2 weeks ago, we introduced the protected classes. And within these protected classes, there are protected class groups that are more likely to experience housing inequities or housing discrimination. The reason that I wanted to bring this up again is because the state statute says that cities have to consider the state and federal protected classes. So the ones in blue are the federal protected classes. The ones in orange are the state protected classes, and source of income includes housing vouchers. And domestic violence includes people who are experiencing domestic violence, that not be something that they can be discriminated against with respect to housing. So those are the protected classes. I also want to point out that in the handouts, you may have noticed that some jurisdictions have locally designated protected classes, and cities have the option of also considering those groups when you start to think about who are we building housing for. Next slide. So, all right, so we've got this idea of the who in fair housing, but what are the areas that we need to be concerned about looking at? I mean, housing's a big topic. And so, HUD has provided some guidance in that area in the form of their proposed rule for doing what they're now calling equity plans, which are fair housing plans. And so these are the areas that HUD requires cities who have to do these new housing equity plans. These are the areas that they have to look at. We have first segregation and integration, which is one of the very reasons that the whole Fair Housing Act got passed. Racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, disparities in access to opportunity, inequitable access to affordable housing and homeownership opportunities, and then laws and procedures and practices that impede the provision of the housing that we need. Inequitable distribution of local resources. Does the sewer line end where the low-income neighborhood begins? That was actually something I experienced when I was a VISTA volunteer in Kentucky, where all the Black people lived. All of a sudden, the sewer line ended there. Laws, practices, and procedures that impede the provision of, we already talked about that. And then last of all, the discrimination or violations of civil rights. So are there cases where the city has violated, has been charged with discrimination or violation of civil rights? So next slide. As a kind of a working, I'll say, mental map for these areas that we should be considering, we put together some fair housing issue areas to look at. They're essentially a repackaging of the items that the state came up with for the purpose of being congruent with what the housing production strategy is supposed to be focused on and supposed to achieve. So we have fair access to rental housing, fair access to home ownership, patterns of integration and segregation, and within that, how they overlay with patterns of poverty and affluence. And then fair access to community assets, and environmental justice is included in fair access to community assets because it also involves the avoidance of harms or the things that are negative in the community. How is that distributed? And then finally, fair housing, fair access to housing for people with disabilities. I want to mention that these are draft, and 2 meetings from now, you're going to have a chance to really talk about these and whether something's missing, whether some should be combined, if these make sense. For example, we know that home ownership and rental housing aren't necessarily a binary. It's that there is a continuum between rental housing and home ownership due to things like shared equity and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting land trusts and things like that. So next slide. So you'll have a chance to talk about that later. This week, we're focusing on the intersection between fair access to rental housing, home ownership, and fair access to housing with people with disabilities. Again, think about the protected classes who need those things and how that intersects with the needed housing characteristics. Next slide. So next week, we're going to be focusing on patterns of integration and segregation, fair access to community assets, and fair access to housing for people with disabilities, and how those things interact with location. Now, it's not that all of these don't both interact with location and characteristics, but we've broken it out for now because we think that these are where some of the main questions for you to talk about lie. Next slide. So again, today's meeting, I'll just say, is characteristics, rental housing, home ownership, and housing for people with disabilities. And then the final slide. And this is just the things to kind of take away and tuck in the back of your mind as we enter into the discussion. So remember, it's a whole community effort, not just a planning exercise or the planning department. And it requires using the broad range of powers that the city can muster to deal with our critical need for housing. And I think we're going to invite Alan to see if he has anything to add and maybe bring this a little bit down to earth.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tremolay. And the first thing I'll say to bring this to kind of ground us even more is we didn't meet last week, which was the first week of April, and I'd be remiss if I didn't wish folks a happy Fair Housing Month. So this is April. Tomorrow is actually the anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act, April 11th. So it's quite fortuitous that we're here today. So wanted to make sure I didn't miss that opportunity. The second piece, if you've heard me talk about what we are doing with Goal 10 right now and this marriage between Goal 10 and fair housing that we've created, right? And for folks that may be married or in other very committed relationships, I think what you'd recognize is when you enter into that relationship, there's a whole world beyond that you can't even imagine from where you might have come from. And that's kind of where we're headed with what we're doing in Goal 10 planning housing, right? We had this process before that was a little mechanical. We're marrying it with this work that we're doing around fair housing and how does it intersect with characteristics, location, and all those other pieces. And it's this whole other world that we haven't experienced and couldn't have imagined before us. And it really does show up when we start to talk about things like, what are those elements that we might collaborate with other folks outside the city, outside our own departments, in looking at what levers does a city have to pull. There's a whole world of levers out there that we might not have thought about before in these processes. So just wanted to bring that forward. And the other part I'd say about Fair Housing Month, HUD's theme for Fair Housing Month this year is putting the act into action. And I think that what we're doing here in Oregon is such a supreme example of how we see fair housing concepts like this show up in our work every day and moving into the future. And I'm just so grateful for the work that's being done here. And as we start to move into this conversation and think about how those two things get married together, and today in characteristics and then next week in location.
Thank you, Alan, very much, and Andre, and perfect place to leave it, which is putting the act into action. So for the discussion today, a few things. There are 5 questions listed in the agenda. There are 15-ish of you here to speak to the questions. So just please be mindful of that and the timing. We have about an hour for this discussion. The other thing is we're not going to take them in the order they're listed. So, and maybe someone can put in the chat the order that we are going to take them, but we're going to start with the 3rd question. We'll do 3, 2, 4, 1, 5, and we'll get that in the chat so you can follow along, but just know that we'll start with the 3rd question. I'd also like to really lean on and pull from the experts we have in the room who work with the Fair Housing Act and people who are of protected classes. So I'd really prefer, we have many experts, those of you who work with fair housing on a daily basis and would like to pull from your expertise into the conversation to get us kicked off this morning. I think that's all I have. I just want to reiterate, Andre summarized in the beginning or in her presentation what is already included in the housing production strategy framework in statute and in rules. We're really hoping that sort of act into action today, getting from you where you think things need to change, where things need to be augmented to fully address the new statute and direction around needed housing characteristic, which is not totally defined as we discussed before, and around affirmatively furthering fair housing and how these can come together. So starting with question number 3, how can or should a local government plan for and support creation of needed housing characteristics? And then there's some examples in here that came from our brainstorming session a month ago. You all had mentioned potential characteristics could include number of bedrooms, other culturally specific characteristics like maybe multiple kitchens in a household or in a unit, or other accessibility features to meet the needs of people with disabilities or aging folks. So question for you is, how can or should local governments, the whole of local governments, support these characteristics or these types of characteristics? And then what are some potential trade-offs as we think about that? And it would be really super, maybe if we heard from Alan or Kathy or Kim, Nathan, Shannon, others of you that work with these populations. Thank you, Julia. Go right ahead.
Sure, and I apologize, I'm off camera today. Nursing a sick dog back to health, so not camera ready today. I've mentioned this before, but just for good measure, I guess, in the appropriate note-taking place. I think one of the ways that this can happen is kind of recognizing that a lot of these unit types and goals, or sorry, unit characteristics and goals take up more space. And so with that, contemplating how that relates to things like FAR limits, density calculations. I've seen some cities kind of do some smart things in terms of kind of creating ratios for their density for smaller units. So even if they're using a unit-based density code as opposed to FAR, you can still kind of give some wiggle room for smaller units versus bigger units. And then within that, also creating incentives, bonuses, kind of things to kind of lean into reflecting values and needs for certain unit types, meaning creating either FAR or density or height or lot coverage bonuses or allowances for certain unit types to kind of mitigate the added cost and space required to build those types of things, to really kind of move things in that direction, move the market in that direction.
Thanks, Julia. So some potential land use or code options to incentivize some of the types of units that may be bigger or smaller depending on the needs. I appreciate that. Alan, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for Andre for giving a really great kind of overview and contextualizing this. I want to start with kind of one big piece, which is when I was working at the city of Portland, the difficulty that we had in implementing policy that was on the books with respect to visitability being zero-step entrances, wide halls and doors. And what I think Julia was alluding to earlier, which is the larger bathrooms that are needed to meet ADA regulations that take away from the kind of extra space. The challenge that we've had, and honestly, like a roadblock that we've run into in implementing these policies, is that they're baked into the zoning code as incentives. And the inspectors who are working at the Bureau of Development Services fall into two categories. They're zoning code inspectors or building code inspectors. Visitability literally does both, right? It's the external staircases or lack thereof to get in, which is a zoning code inspection, and the internal elements of a bathroom hallway design, which is a building code inspector. And BDS, in conversations when I was at the city, said we don't have people who do both of those. So we can't implement this because our external zoning code inspectors don't do internal and our internal don't do external. And so therefore we can't really implement this rule. Well, it feels short-sighted to me. It feels like this is saying there's a problem that we have a policy solution for, but we don't have the staffing and or management that can kind of get us to that solution. And so increasingly, my understanding is that we need land use and building code officials working together to solve these problems, not to punt on these problems. And I think it rises to the same issue at the state level. We here don't have the building codes division at the table who hold the building code, or at least the ability to add things like visitability into the building code, which is currently not defined. And we've tried through legislative processes and it's been shot down in the past. And so there's a state local kind of combination of inspections that needs to happen in order to allow us to think about accessibility. I may have some other things to mention later, but I think that was the top one.
That's really helpful, Alan, and helpful to remind us about, this is sort of, some of these are in that realm of other things a city can be doing to make these easier to develop and make it simpler. And one of those things is ensuring there is that coordination internally, whether it's at between state and local or within a city itself. So I really appreciate that. Shannon, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, well, again, just really appreciate all of the background to set the context for this conversation. I think that was so helpful and productive. I looked this up the other day because I was interested, and currently our Habitat for Humanity network across the state, 85 to 90% of the homes that we're building are middle housing, and 10 to 15% are single detached. And I just share that because I think a lot of people think of Habitat as being a single detached home. And in reality, land is one of our most expensive costs. And the middle housing policy has really helped us to start to maximize the number of households that we serve. And I see cities doing a lot of wonderful, flexible things to promote that increased access in high opportunity areas. And for example, here's just one example that we see cities doing, right, to lift up good practices, like where we're building townhomes, that allowing us to have some of the units be horizontal, sort of across what you think of as two separate units, and then reconfigure the firewalls so that we can have a fully accessible unit instead of only visitable units. I also think that maybe HUD has been a strong partner of ours in the homeownership realm for really enforcing the importance of visibility, so that it is very standard for us to have at least one zero-step entry, an accessible bathroom, and hopefully in most instances, one bedroom on the first floor, even with these middle housing designs. And then I'm just gonna surface something that I don't know, I currently find to be a reality is just time, right? Like it does take time, and our program takes time too. And some of that time is good. So like if we select a future homeowner with special physical mobility requirements, having time lets us specifically meet those requirements instead of putting a family into a pre-built unit. And that's something that I think is kind of special about the Habitat for Humanity model. And so we want to go fast, 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 and yet sometimes slow is important. And then as I think of things, and just I by and large we find cities pretty great to work with. Like I want to say those words on design. But something that can be frustrating sometimes has to do with the I'm going to call them external to the building requirements. Like maybe we want a play structure and the future homeowners of a community want a play structure. And then you have to have like fall space, but like the city is requiring like so many shrubs that we can't have the allotted fall space for the play structure. And that's clearly not what that policy was designed to do, right? And maybe we're like kind of close to an elementary school. And there's a watershed, and like the city they really want a sidewalk from the housing development to the school. And like, that's a great thing. But when we talk to the residents, like they really want a community garden space. And to have just like a little more, maybe it is time or opportunity for that stakeholder engagement where we can say like, how about we do a sidewalk and a community garden instead of like sidewalk, we're done. Those are things that come to my mind.
That's really helpful, Shannon, to hear those real world experiences and that sort of need for thinking beyond just the structure, but in the site design as well, and the context of place. So I appreciate that. Kim, please go ahead. And then I see Garland and Kathy, I think I see your hand up too. Yes, I do. Okay, so great. I will get to you. Go ahead, Kim, please. Thank you.
Hi, Kim McCarty with Community Alliance of Tenants. When I hear about these contradictions, like about visitability or, housing production where you're trying to meet multiple goals, it seems to me that the Fair Housing Act, like leaning on affirmatively furthering fair housing, could be a tool to our jurisdictions to say, okay, we're trying to meet many goals, but this might be the ultimate goal. And this is where you can find some relief for finding that flexibility or pressing upon your bureaus to work together, to be more collaborative and overcome this, the sense that, no, we can't do it because, we've got two different shops as an example. So that's one thing I wanted to bring up. I think the rulemaking is also an opportunity to share these tools with jurisdictions that perhaps haven't thought of, what's available to them. So an example that comes to mind, I don't know if it was successful, but, using trading off FAR so that you could meet certain population goals, saying to the potential future developers, if you meet this particular goal that we have, then we're going to give you an incentive, an additional FAR that you can utilize elsewhere, as an example. And then lastly, when we're talking about housing characteristics, I have often brought up, culture as being one of the elements, but of course that's not really well defined. So I just wanted to give an example. Our housing type doesn't accommodate very well for immigrant and refugee communities that may have been accustomed, as an example, to courtyard housing, where you have multiple generations. So not just a large household, a large family, but actually multiple generations of family with the appropriate privacy or configurations for how those family structures are accommodated within their housing. And our zoning and building codes, et cetera, are far from accommodating those types of considerations.
Thank you, Kim. Really appreciate that. And again, appreciate the sort of specific examples of things you've seen working or not working in other communities. Garland, go ahead, please.
Sure thing. So, some things that cities can do for planning for needing housing characteristics include switching to form-based codes and away from regulating either FAR or density, to instead regulate just the elements of building mass, that's height, setbacks, and lot coverage, and the interface with the public realm, things like style, porches, windows, etc. This at least allows the market to build more smaller units or fewer larger units without running up against density or FAR limits while still maintaining neighborhood character. Cities can also provide for alternate development forms, such as cluster or courtyard housing, that may trade off smaller exterior setbacks in favor of more shared or common space. And this can provide for multi-generational households to live adjacent to one another, and thus for more flexibility. So yeah, +1 on cluster housing. And there are some really specific things that cities need to do to allow cluster housing to be feasible within their jurisdictions.
Thank you, Garland, for additional practical ideas. And just to clarify for anyone who's wondering, FAR is floor area ratio. It's often, not always, but often used in zoning codes to either control the minimum or maximum size a building can take up on a lot. So it's related to how big the structure should or can be on a lot. So when you hear FAR, that's what folks are talking about. It's
and just a quick follow-up. FAR hasn't traditionally been used to regulate single-family zones until Portland hired a third-rate planning consultant called Diet Bhatia out of California that had been fired off many jobs. They recommended using FAR against the best advice of thought leaders in the planning profession who say FAR is an inappropriate tool to regulate single-family housing for a variety of reasons. We tried to warn Portland from regulating single-family zones with FARs. So I'm just putting that out there.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, that we really shouldn't be regulating single-family with FAR. It's inappropriate to do so.
Thank you. Celestina, do you have something you're hoping to ask about or contribute? And then Kathy, I'll get to you right after that.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Certainly, I think that we recognize that there is a relationship with characteristics and types, and this is a challenging nut to crack. But I'm just offering maybe for us to think about some of the other characteristics that we brainstormed, and maybe Mari, since I'm taking notes, maybe you could take a look at some of our meeting 2 notes and drop in the chat some of the characteristics that we all brainstormed, and consider what a city can do, or how we might encourage, even, for example, number of bedrooms. And so maybe there's a diversity in that, diversity in the number of bedrooms, which the diversity that's needed is more larger bedroom counts in units and other characteristics like that. And the reason we're kind of pushing and asking on this is because it isn't typical that cities are planning for housing at that level of specificity and characteristics. Alan, I appreciated the note regarding, building codes and how that also relates in terms of characteristics, and there's not necessarily an answer in land use, and even if that's a similar comment for other of these characteristics, then that's fine, and perhaps that's what we'll note, and that's what we'll kind of see what we can do in terms of next steps on. But just an ask to see if we can grapple with some of these unwieldy characteristics.
Yeah, thank you for that, Celestina. And just a couple, including various characteristics for people with disabilities and visitability, which we've talked about, but also thinking about if there's some difference between access to rental housing and access to homeownership. And again, not just in the realm of land use, but what else can cities be doing to actively promote those types of units being available and produced, as well as affordability. So I see a few hands up, and I just want to be mindful that we have other questions, but I don't want to shut this down because this is a really critical and important piece. So Kathy, I know you are next, and please go ahead.
I want to piggyback on 2 of the issues that have been raised. One is the problem with the building code inspectors not having the jurisdiction or not having it within their portfolio to be looking at accessibility characteristics. I think you should also add training, because I do not believe that people who are doing the inspections have any idea of the requirements that are very specific under the Federal Fair Housing Act and under the UFAS, which is what is required for units with federal money. They are very specific, and I don't think the building code people have any idea how they need to be implemented. I have many people tell me they're searching for accessible housing, and they're told that there's an accessible unit, and what it means is you can get in the door, period. So the second thing is we also need to think about building housing with not only multiple bedrooms that you would need for a family, but also when you're going to have group homes and group facilities, you're going to need multiple bedrooms as well as common space to be able to support and site the people with disabilities in those spaces, as well as supporting them in the siting, which is a whole different issue.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for bringing up some ideas about actions cities can take that are training related and getting coordinated so that everyone's on the same page about what's needed and desired and how to carry out these intentions. I appreciate that. So I'm going to go Julia, Brock, Brianne, and then I'm likely going to move us on to the next question unless there's some other burning input for this one. But Julia.
Deb, if you want to let Brock and Brianne go first since they haven't gone yet, that's totally fine.
Wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that, Julie. Go ahead, Brock.
Okay, yeah, I'll be quick, and I'm not sure if they apply best to this question, but I think they could fit into both, or into multiple. One, I think, could we create kind of like specifically related to disability, ready build plans that have specific characteristics so that we can help, kind of expedite the process of getting those built and cut down on timing for, plan development and stuff like that. The other piece, and I'd love to hear from other people who have a little more expertise in this, but I feel like developing more kind of like open floor plan homes might be really helpful for 3 of the 4 kind of types of disability that we're looking at for mobility, visual, and hearing. Mobility, just because it's more open space, and so you can orient furniture in a way that makes it easier to get around. Visually, just because kind of same thing, again, you can place the furniture where you need to. So if you're visually impaired, you know where it is. And then as far as hearing, right, if you have someone in the kitchen and someone in the living room and they need to communicate through like sign language, for example, if there's a wall there, they might not be able to communicate directly. They have to, go into the other room to talk to the other person. But if there's visual sight line access between the two, as would with a more open floor concept, then I think they would be able to have that communication a little bit easier as well.
Thank you. Some additional options for maybe layouts that would be more flexible over time and accessible over time. I appreciate that. Brianne, please go ahead.
Thanks. I would just kind of add on what some others have said and just kind of say that I just hope that we focus really on this being more permissive and kind of increasing incentives, like whether that's through form-based code, removing density, and FAR limits, especially for affordable units, and hopefully not get into the more kind of prescriptive and restrictive, because every community is so different. Like, for example, I know everyone's talking about kind of these multi-generational homes, but in Bend, one of our big issues is actually we don't have enough single bedroom or studios. So I would just hope we don't wade into that kind of level of specificity of what unit types, just make sure that it's more inclusive and can be more site specific for different communities.
Good reminder that housing production is not the same everywhere and hasn't been. And yeah, Bend is short on smaller units. Other cities are long on smaller units and short on bigger units. So I appreciate that.
And the needs change over time, right? So just anything that we could be to be more permissive and I guess less restrictive and over time, I think would be more helpful for cities in implementing this.
Great. Thank you so much, Brianne. I appreciate that. Julia, and then Alan, I know you have one more item to add, which is great. Thank you. Go ahead, Julia.
So I just wanted to give both Kim and Shannon's responses were kind of making my wheels spin a little bit on some examples of projects that I've done in the past that I just wanted to kind of name in hopes of, I don't know, creating ideas of reducing barriers for those types of developments elsewhere in the state, to respond to some of these characteristics. So kind of on the culturally relevant side of things, back when I was doing affordable homeownership specifically related to mitigating gentrification in Northeast Portland, a lot of the feedback we were getting was just kind of acknowledging that folks had been displaced from single family homes. That wasn't what they were able to return to, but kind of think about characteristics of single family homes that had a lot of cultural relevancy, and the front porch was huge in that conversation. And so one of the things that kind of came up in the missing middle code update here was making sure there were allowances for kind of for plexes going back on the site, as opposed to requiring every front door to face the front street in order to allow for porches on every single unit that way. It was an imperfect solution, but one that was kind of trying to thread that needle. So kind of creative allowances for front door orientation and things like that to allow for that. Multi-generational. I had a couple of projects where we had a few different ideas on that. One, I don't know how well it's actually worked out because it is a kind of lease up process, but mix of unit types within same buildings. So studios up to 3 bedrooms, with the idea that, grandma or someone could move into the studio, and then the family with kids can move into a 2 or 3 bedroom within the same complex. There's some kind of property management lease up processes to actually ensure that can happen, and some complicated fair housing lines to think about there, but just wanted to name that unit mix helps with that. And then also just in terms of flexibility of unit sizes, we had a project that was an open air walk up, meaning not an internal corridor, but I feel like you could probably do this with an internal corridor too, where we had a studio unit placed across the hall from a 2-bedroom unit intentionally, then with an additional door that could close that off at the end of the wing in order to basically create a larger unit based on what our renters were needing in terms of demand for family size. And so that's kind of a building code thing in terms of just making fire life safety can allow that. But just wanted to name a few examples of how code has not gotten in the way of these things, in hopes that we can kind of think through eliminating those elsewhere if they are in the way.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia, for the examples too of how sort of building in a little flexibility can help a community address its local needs or cultural needs of folks who live there. I really appreciate that. Alan, please go ahead.
Yeah, so 2 quick additions. So first and foremost, to understand our needed characteristics, especially around accessibility, we need to know what our existing units are, and we really don't have a handle on that. I've got some deeper ideas about how to develop proxies. I'm a researcher and have thought a lot about this, and I'd be happy, not now, but to share a little bit more about how we can develop a method for understanding that, or at least to estimate that. But my actual comment has more to do with a reflection on Shannon's kind of comments, which got my wheels spinning too. The idea of stacked flats and reasonable accommodations for renters brings up the question about modifications, in particular, how to get, ramps so people can get into homes. But more importantly, what are we able to do with residential elevators? And there's 2 pieces to this. One is the adaptability of existing structures with the adaptability of new construction. Could we put those stacked closets on top of each other that created an elevator shaft in the future that could easily be retrofitted to add that? Do we have a residential elevator code? Is it possible for us to think about non-commercial residential elevators and to lessen what is those requirements for smaller units to actually allow for more of those to be created? And then what opportunities might we have for putting external elevators on the outside of buildings that would create essentially those townhouse duplex triplexes, for converting those into stacked flats that might just require a little excavation to get that first level elevator on the ground floor and then moving that up to the top. And I've seen some examples of housing in Portland that could convert an attic space into a small studio, and it could move the townhomes into what would be stacked flats. And so there's something about elevators right now that I've been thinking a lot about. I shared with the Portland group recently. Can we unlock opportunity for accessible housing by rethinking the way we're doing elevators? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alan, for bringing that issue up. I'm seeing quite a few nodding heads. I saw Shannon nod her head and smile. I'm guessing Habitat's been sorting through what some of those options are as well, as they're thinking about how to meet middle housing types as well. Thank you all. I am going to move us on. Again, this won't be the last time we talk about characteristics, but we will get there. Garland, I'm going to move us on here. So next question, how much can or should permanent affordability structures be planned for or prioritized differently than structures with affordability covenants that have more limited durations? And Celestina or Mari, I don't know if it might be helpful to expand a little bit on some examples about what you are thinking is related to characteristics here.
Sure, I'll jump in, and Maddie, please tag on whatever I miss here. In the framework of types, characteristics, and locations, it seems that affordability is a characteristic. It's not a type itself, it's not the structure, it's also not really the location. So while, it does operate a little bit differently than something like bedroom size or bedroom count, it does seem like that's the best place for us to unpack some of those questions. And it also, similar to other characteristics, doesn't have as clear a pathway in terms of standard land use planning about actually planning for various affordability types.
And maintenance.
Great. Thank you for expanding on that. So, and there are inherent trade-offs here, obviously, but permanently affordable structures or housing or planning for housing that might be prioritized that have less permanent affordability. So Garland, please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, quickly, I just wanted to second Alan's lifting up of residential elevators. When I was a small developer, if I could have built residential elevators to provide access to every unit I built, I would have. I think given our coming demographic shift, the baby boomer generation is the generation that holds most of the wealth. Why wouldn't you want to make sure that every unit is something that an aging buyer could see themselves living in, regardless of what happens with their health or their ability over time? But there's a problem, which is that if you're serving, I believe, more than 2 units with the residential elevator, it gets classed as a commercial elevator. And so we need to reform our elevator code in Oregon to allow it to align with missing middle housing types. So you can serve, I would say, up through 6 units with a residential class elevator before you have to switch from what's like a $40,000 or $50,000 elevator to something that's over like a $120,000 elevator when you switch from residential to commercial elevator codes. But moving on to the current question about how we can provide for permanent affordability structures. I've got 2 answers. The first is limited equity housing cooperatives paired with community land trusts or CLT LECs. This provides for resident control as well as permanent affordability, as well as the ability to earn limited amounts of equity to provide for generational wealth building. Square One Villages is showing us all how to do this with their projects in Eugene and Springfield, and really showing the path forward, and that what's really needed is funding to allow this to happen. And then related to that is to allow buildings and developments such as housing clusters or courtyard buildings to meet affordability targets with an average building annual income threshold rather than per unit or per household numbers. This way, if existing residents grow their income, then new residents would need to be lower income to bring down the average and then remain below the target over time. And Santa Barbara is the jurisdiction that has been leading with adoption of this policy.
Great, thank you. So an average that helps get at mixed income living arrangements. Great, thank you.
Yeah, exactly.
Shannon and then Michael. Oh.
Thank you. I'll be quick. or try to be. I just wanted to call out that permanently affordable home ownership can be at various income ranges. So I did want to share something we've observed at Habitat for Humanity. We serve up to 80% AMI, and as I've mentioned before, our average served statewide is actually 46%. By and large, for the homeowners that we serve, a lot of people think of like entry level home ownership or a starter home. That is not what we see. We see people pay off their mortgage and stay in their home and pass it on generationally. So that is one kind of permanently affordable home ownership. I just wanted to put it out there that this is probably where people are going to live, right? And it's a basis of other good things in their life. And we have some new incentives in the governor's housing production package, right, to encourage affordable housing, including homeownership development up to 120% AMI. The way my brain works, thinking about equity, I especially love the idea of these like just slightly higher income housing units remaining permanently affordable, because I think they will be starter homes at that slightly higher AMI, those households will achieve some equity, just like that's how permanent affordability works. You get usually a third of what you would market rate equity. True for Habitat homeowners, true at higher income ranges, right? So they will get some equity, but then that sort of entry-level housing stock isn't lost, right? It remains affordable in the future for someone in that same income range. And we've had decades of underproduction of starter homes in our state too, because they haven't penciled. In part because of things like SDC charges being flat, no matter what income range you're serving or size of house. If it's 5,000 square feet or 800, same SDC, until you advocate for something different locally, right? So we've had some structures that accidentally make it cheaper per square foot to build bigger units, and costs go up until you build the bigger unit. That we need to build more starter homes, and we need to preserve the availability of starter homes, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. Appreciate that, and appreciate hearing sort of the experience of people that are living in Habitat homes over time as well. Michael, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I kind of have two comments on this, focusing on the how much or how should we be planning or prioritizing the different housings. And I think that is something that can be done through the housing needs analysis and housing production strategy requirements. And maybe that is something that needs to be refined, especially in the housing production strategies, to figure out how do you prioritize those. We have 4 housing agencies or groups in our community that we rely on heavily as we go through that planning process to let us know what the needs are in our community. And taking that information and then plugging it into your housing production strategy is, I think, how you would prioritize that. And I think the second piece I have, which I think I'm kind of maybe going on a tangent, is I really don't like the word covenants, and I don't like covenants at all. And I think that I'm not sure if the context of how it's applied here is what my brain is thinking, but covenants are a huge barrier to affordable housing, and I don't think they should be permanent. And I know House Bill 2003 addressed the creation of new covenants being established after the effective date of that bill. But I think there should be some retroactive expiration date of covenants that we need to somehow get these off of the books, because jurisdictions can't enforce covenants, but yet they are a barrier to new development. And I don't know. I think somehow we need to fold that in and find a way to retroactively expire covenants that create these barriers. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And I think I'm seeing a lot of support for that idea. And I know I heard it in the Housing Accountability TAC meeting yesterday as well. I think language choice is really important here. I believe, and I'll look to Celestina and Marty to confirm, I believe what they meant by covenants in this context is more land trusts and Habitat for Humanity models where it's protecting affordability, not the covenants that are operated by private homeowners in a very different way that's not about protecting affordability. But I think we need to be really cautious in how we use that terminology.
Yeah, but just on that as well, even for protecting the affordability, I guess my thought on that is nothing is forever. And
Yeah.
so we just need to kind of keep in mind that even if we create an affordable housing situation, once somebody is in that house and they become a permanent resident of that house, you know, they make improvements and suddenly things that, you know, are affordable to them is not affordable to the next person. And so trying to create a permanent scenario long-term is something that kind of makes me nervous. So.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Rachel, and then Ariel and Julia, and then I am going to move us on past that. So Rachel, go ahead.
Thank you. In this space, I just wanted to lift up the idea of, in the limited equity ownership model with the community land trust, the importance of an accelerated equity implementation where there is some sort of support or subsidy available. So residents who do own those homes could potentially have a lower or a shorter mortgage term to build equity faster and to make it to, you know, build generational wealth in a way that is more effective and can help families, you know, move into a model or to single detached dwellings that we typically see in homeownership, and then open up those community land trust homes to new buyers. At NOAA, we're working on this, trying to get some funding, working with Senator Merkley's office on an accelerated equity model. And we're really excited about, you know, some potential funds that might become available at some point. But I think that funding is really important to support accelerated equity.
Great, thank you. Thank you again to all of you for sharing best practices and some new ideas that are emerging for how to make this happen. Ariel Nelson, please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I think all of that is really important. But in terms of what the local government, what a city's role is in their HPS, I just want to echo some of what Mike said about, you know, what can go in the HPS. I mean, I don't think it's possible to plan for and code affordability for this kind of deeper affordability in such that it's highly dependent on access to resources, and that came up in a meeting yesterday. And so how cities do that, I think, has to be pretty flexible, because obviously there's a huge difference between, you know, cities that have access to public funding in the metro area and cities in other parts of the state that don't. And so, you know, certainly where a city does own surplus land, and that's not the case in every community, right, that is appropriate for housing or, you know, is truly surplus, there's absolutely ways that a city can prioritize that land and be working with partners to plan for affordability. But where that's not the case, I think it's difficult to, you know, specifically zone for or in specific areas, but it's going to look different. And so based on what a city has to work with, and I think that's where, again, the connection to the resource at OHCS are going to be really, we talked about this yesterday, are going to be really important for a city to be able to plan, because it's really difficult for a city to plan if they don't, you know, to actually reach these levels of affordability that are needed in every community. They have to know that resources are going to come. So I think that's going to be a key component of that. And then I think critical in the HPS is like identifying the partners, whether it's, you know, some communities have a lot of local partners, some have some. In some places, it's really just the state and trying to figure out how to get an affordable developer to come to town. But figuring out who those partners are and that coordination strategy is I think, a key part of the housing production strategy.
Thank you, Ariel. And that sort of thinking around surplus land as well as maybe falls in that bucket that is beyond the planning department or community development department, but is definitely within the realm of a city where they have those city-owned surplus lands. Julia, just give me a second. I see Andre's hand up, and I'm guessing she either has a question or a comment to address. So go ahead, Andre.
And I could do it now or later, but essentially, just want to mention that we need to be careful about unintended consequences of embracing the longer the affordability, the better it is. There's people, I've heard people of color expressing concern about being channeled into a form of homeownership that limits their ability to grow equity. And so in that case, we're talking about kind of the trade-off between, I'll just say, a down payment assistance program where something goes in as a forgivable loan, forgiven over time, versus money that goes into securing the permanent affordability of a building in exchange for limiting the resale and so forth and so on. I'm not advocating one or the other here, but I just am offering a word of caution is to consult with the community, think about the trade-offs, and proceed, in that vein. They're countervailing arguments to the concerns that I raised. So we don't have to spend time in this meeting debating it. But since it hadn't been raised, I just wanted to mention it as something to put up there. So please don't feel like you need to argue against that statement or provide the countervailing arguments.
Thank you, Andre. I see lots of hands up. I need to check in with the DLCD team because we have about 10 minutes-ish of discussion. There are, as you can see, many questions still on the table. I think some of them have been partially addressed through the conversation already. But Mari, what would you like me to do to manage these last 10 minutes? We can move on to the next question around climate adaptation, or we can keep expanding on this one and sort out how to address these other ones later.
Yeah, I'm inclined to move us ahead to be able to hit on the last characteristic type that is focused on climate, and then
ask forgiveness.
and maybe just maybe final thoughts on the last two questions so that we can capture some feedback. We will be able to send this out later, so if you all did not offer feedback in this meeting, please engage with this Miro board is what I'll note.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I am going to move us on so we can at least get a conversation going. And again, we can bring these back later as we start getting more specifically into rulemaking ideas in May. So the question on the table is, how can local governments effectively consider climate adaptation and mitigation considerations into the housing planning work, particularly concerning housing characteristics? And some of the ideas that came up in this context in meeting 2, I noted were issues around water and stormwater and site design, issues around exterior air quality, which may be more location, but could also be characteristic. And then natural hazard risk, which also is location, but could also be about, materials you use for housing units, things like that. I'm sure there are others. So how can local governments effectively consider climate adaptation and mitigation and housing planning for characteristics? Garland, go ahead.
Thanks. So housing needs to be planned in such a manner that it's location efficient. This means no more residential subdivisions. We must plan for complete neighborhoods with 5-minute, 10-minute, and 15-minute walk sheds planned to ensure access to parks, open space, grocery stores, restaurants, and other amenities. And complete neighborhoods must include minimum average densities to ensure that sufficient customers exist to support the businesses needed to provide walkable amenities, as well as to support transit service. Complete communities must be located outside of flood or sea level rise zones and must be surrounded by defensible space buffers against wildfires where that's a threat. And we must make sure that the zoned capacity for our jurisdictions represents roughly 4 to 5 times the estimated demand during the planning horizon period, so that the market has sufficient capacity available to deliver more homes in the most location efficient areas where demand is highest rather than forcing growth out to the edges of a place where location efficiency is the worst.
All right, thank you, Garland. Other thoughts about ways to manage climate adaptation and mitigation through housing characteristic planning? Yeah, Ariel Kane, thank you.
Hi, yeah, a little different than housing location. I'm thinking a little bit about some of the policies we have in Portland around our investment frameworks for affordable housing specifically. So just a couple of things that come to mind is the Affordable Housing Green Building Policy that ensures that construction funded by Portland sort of advances our environmental and social goals, as well as our economic goals, as well as the air conditioning requirements that PHB is asking for housing that utilizes public funds. As well as sort of related to the location is still Portland Housing Bureau has an investment framework that prioritizes location considerations for that access to transportation services as well as green spaces. So a little bit of that, not just adaptation, but mitigation in terms of being in cooler areas and having greater access to clean air. And then, of course, we have the PSEF, the Climate Investment Fund here in Portland that helps create energy efficient homes that sort of helps with that adaptation as well as mitigation side of building characteristics.
Great, thank you. Really appreciate the thoughtfulness about what Portland's been doing to invest in various features, including thinking about sort of the role of green spaces either on the site or near a site and helping with climate mitigation and adaptation. Mary Kyle, please go ahead.
Just adding to what Ariel just said and Garland about existing neighborhoods is to ensure that our existing neighborhoods, particularly those of high opportunity, are opened up through zoning and other measures to more diverse, dense, and affordable housing types. Those areas overlap with the areas that have very good tree canopy, higher incomes, and tend to be rental deserts. They're lower density neighborhoods, and we need to open those up because they also are the most accessible to schools, parks, all of that already. So it's not just new neighborhoods, it's the existing neighborhoods. We really have to open those up. And that mitigates climate and also makes for more affordable living because you don't have to always use your car or drive it as far to get to where you need to go. Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate that. Go ahead, Julia.
So kind of similar related to what Ariel was getting at. I also just want to again put a plug in for existing state requirements for affordable housing development. So anyone who gets OHTS money have to follow certain design guidelines as well, and they have their own versions of kind of the Portland components that Ariel was outlining. I bring that up both in terms of a resource potentially for cities to look at and point to, but also just to put a request in, I guess, for trying to avoid death by 1,000 paper cuts for developments that are already very heavily regulated, meaning affordable housing, capital A affordable housing. And so when there are any requirements coming down that are, just different enough from the requirements that are coming through the funding requirements or even conflict with those in some ways, that can basically cause affordable housing development to not happen in those jurisdictions, just due to kind of invisible costs and challenges. So just want to note, referencing existing requirements around these things can be helpful on both ends.
Yeah, thank you. And also a reminder of that alignment between what the HPS has, what requirements come with either federal or state funding is really important to make sure that we aren't creating new problems or sort of overlapping problems. But hearing you on the positives and negatives of those requirements. Ariel Kane and then Ariel Nelson.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'll be really fast. I just think my sustainability pals here at the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability would be upset if I didn't mention that the most sustainable building is the one that already exists. And so not just, I know we're primarily thinking about producing new units, but we're also trying to figure out the adaptive reuse component and how that might be able to produce new units, and other ways that we can sort of encourage just climate mitigation and adaptation. There's other programs in our community, like the wood burn exchange program for higher efficiency heating and cooling, and the deconstruction program. So I think that there's probably more that we could do as a city as well, but I'm just sort of thinking about that in terms of what is possible for climate adaptation and mitigation.
Thank you, Ariel. And that ties into with Mary Kyle's comments about doing more with what we already have and increasing density in some of our rich asset-rich neighborhoods. Ariel Nelson.
Thanks. Yeah, just building on to what a lot of people have said, and appreciating Julia's nod to existing requirements. Similarly, we have climate-friendly and equitable communities rules that are not in effect all around the state, and I don't know if they necessarily should be, but like looking at the general climate-friendly area and transportation planning and kind of looking at how these pieces fit together, I think making sure that we're not adding additional things into the HPS, and also appreciating, a lot of this is prioritized in affordable development resources. And so, maybe there's some room for and I think there would be some education and technical assistance needed for across the state for all cities for this, but looking at ways to incentivize these types of services and programs, whether that's air conditioners and those kinds of things, air quality in market development, but also appreciating the comment about pepper cuts and potentially increased costs on development. But what are ways that cities can help incentivize those kinds of things generally in new development, as well as for existing, naturally occurring affordable housing, where communities of color are living in lower income communities as well in a community, and taking advantage of programs that are coming online, like the green infrastructure program that just got stood up or is getting stood up at DLCD and other programs. There's buckets of money at OHA, OHCS, and on the planning side at DLCD around this type of work. It kind of goes back to my earlier comments on the other one, which is, ensuring that cities can easily access and kind of have some level of predictability of how those funding systems and application timelines flow so that they can line that up with their HPS plan work, I think will be really critical, so that they can try to incentivize both affordable development and other types of development to access and tie in and leverage these state resources. Because I think the majority of cities are not going to have this type of funding or resource or even expertise in some cases, or just staff capacity to focus on these things. And so how do we align with all of the great programs that are either online or coming online, and kind of policies that are baked into a lot of the resources as well?
Thank you. Really good ideas about leveraging and trying to do more, but also be very clear on the intent and availability of the funding. Brock, go ahead, and then we're gonna move into a wrap-up session here.
Yeah, and I'll try to be quick on this one, but I think we got to consider homeownership here too, because we do see, and I think actually, Shannon, this comes from a Habitat resource that I saw, but homeownership units typically have higher energy efficiency than rental units do. And in part, I think that comes from the fact that, when you buy your home, you might not have a lot of money to make efficiency upgrades. But as your wages continue to rise and your mortgage stays consistent, you have a little bit of extra funds. And so you can get, a higher efficiency dishwasher, washer, dryer, refrigerator, different things like that. So making sure that we emphasize homeownership as a way to not only address climate from the government perspective and how we plan and build things, but also from the perspective of individual action, being able to, use each person's ability to eventually make those kind of efficiency improvements.
All right. Thank you, Brock. Thank you all for this discussion. My apologies for not getting through all the questions, but I think the ones we did get through were really rich discussion and lots of new ideas and new pathways to think about for the housing production strategy rule. So I want to do a little bit of a wrap up. We are going to have a little temperature check poll, but before we get there, I'd like to just check in on the racial equity framework questions that Celestina lined out for us at the top of the meeting, and just maybe get a couple minutes of reflections on how we did in this discussion in addressing these, or any sort of key takeaways. I think the question that would have been, for me, the question that probably would have been best pointed at getting this data equity, data justice was one of the questions left on the table around analysis. But I would like to hear if you have some thoughts about how we did in talking about that. And then community engagement and empowerment and needed housing from today's discussion. Any reflections? And I might look to our experts and our staff first to help us along in this.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. I'd echo what you said about, and particularly about the data piece. And I think we've covered it in a couple of spaces where, and particularly qualitative data that might exist and the burden it might place on certain communities as we look at that data. So, or try to gather that data. And what I'd say is that in a lot of instances, we know what exists in our communities. We may not need to repeat those efforts to figure that out. So I think it's something for us to think about as we think about engagement in the future.
Thank you, Alan. And Alan De La Torre, I don't want you to think I've missed out on your offer to have a conversation about how we might fill in the gaps of some data around people with disabilities. So I'll be talking to staff about that, and I'm sure there'll be a follow-up conversation that way. Shannon and then Kim. Go ahead, Shannon.
Just super quickly, I kind of wish we brought that explicitly more into the conversation and the rest of the time today. I think that it's those qualitative community stakeholder engagement conversations that are going to help inform needed unit sizes and types and locations. And so just I want to lift that up and make sure we don't leave it behind. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And we did hear a couple of comments on sort of that local context of cultural needs, who's in your community, what needs aren't being met. Kim, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I did hear people in the room trying to tie it in, and we started with talking about affirmatively furthering fair housing, but the questions that led the conversation that followed that didn't really help us tie back in issues of race. And so I just want to remind everybody that especially in this moment, there is a huge backlash on diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts, a backlash on affirmatively furthering fair housing, on even gathering data that is race-based. And so it is really important that we continue to educate ourselves and ground ourselves, because we wouldn't be in this place if there hadn't been intentional policies to exclude people on the basis of race and color. And so we need intentional policies to undo that harm. And yet we're being pushed in all directions by the courts, by state policy to take on a race neutral stance. And I know that there's that pressure there, but I urge you all to resist it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Yes, the outcomes have not been race neutral, and even the intent for a long time has not been race neutral. Garland, I'm sorry, I'm going to close it there because we have a quick poll. I know we're at 11:30. If you all can just give me one more minute. I don't know if it's Ingrid or Celestina who's populating the poll, but if you could pull that up, great. Thank you.
It's showing up on my end.
Yes, it's showing up on my end now too. Sorry. There's 3 questions, sort of rating scale. I'll let you take a moment to read them and respond, and then we'll bring it to a close. Thank you all.
One thing that maybe I'll say, just kind of hearing the nuggets of connecting the data pieces of the racial equity framework to the discussion, something that maybe staff we can consider is adding a box for that opportunity for you all to offer that feedback on the Miro board. because there is an important nexus with data in terms of this work. And that work is on the equity indicator dashboard pieces that our partner agencies, Oregon Housing and Community Services is kind of managing. And so, but still part of the ONA policy implementation at the state level. So we'll definitely give opportunity to you all there. I heard it loud and clear. So thank you for voicing that. With that, Deb.
Yeah, thank you. At 1 minute past, I think we're going to go ahead and close. It looks like all of you participated, and we have some work to do to improve the effectiveness of our meetings, but really appreciate your time, your thoughtfulness, and sharing your personal experiences and professional experiences today. We will see you next week. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.